Make no bones about it, skeletons are binary, people may not be. One of the things that we do as anthropologists is we look at whether skeletons belong to a male or female. We're very good at doing this, probably about 99% accuracy. There's now a push to prevent anthropologists from undertaking this task because there's a claim that sex is not binary, that it's on a spectrum. If you look at biological sex through the skeleton, then you're talking male-female. But gender is the expression of that. And so people may express themselves in many different ways. I've been told that that's like transphobic or not politically correct, and it's not mean or transphobic or discriminatory. It's the truth.
Hypothetically, if someone was born with like Klinefelter syndrome, having like XXY, female presenting, but they have internal testicles that are producing testosterone at a high rate. If you were to examine the bones of someone with Klinefelter syndrome, what would you deduce? Dr. Elizabeth Weiss, how are you?
I'm doing good, thank you.
Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. I'm really excited to talk. I've been reading some of your articles, and there is an interesting thing happening at the intersection of science and academia and politics that is very, very interesting, that your work and a lot of the controversy around your work has sort of exposed, that I'm really excited to talk about. And it's brought up a lot of things in kind of like hypothetical ethical questions that I've never considered before. So this is going to be a lot of fun.
Great. I think that anthropology is really an important field to save, and which is one of the reasons why I have stepped out of the lab, so to speak, and also have written more popular pieces lately. And even my last book is about really saving the field of anthropology. Yeah.
It's very, very interesting. So you obviously are an anthropologist, you're a professor of anthropology. Up until May, I guess you'll be leaving San Jose. Is it University of San Jose?
San Jose State University.
Okay, got it.
Yes. So I've been at San Jose State University since 2004.
Wow. 20 years. That's good.
20 years.
That's a good run.
And it was a great place for my career because they had a fantastic skeletal collection from what they call the Ryan Mound site, the Ryan Mound collection, with over 300 skeletal remains from like skeletons, some of them almost complete in the sense that they even had finger and toe bones. And I made my career on studying those individuals. And when my last book came out in 2020, Repatriation and Erasing the Past, all hell broke loose.
Yeah.
And I've been kind of sidelined or derailed my career, and the collection is now off limits for study to everybody.
Wow. Hey, what's up, guys? Sorry to interrupt this amazing program, but I need a little bit of help. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can probably see our subscriber number right down here. And if you're able to, it would mean the world if you could subscribe. That is the best way to support this show, because when you subscribe, I'm able to show it to potential guests or to different brands and stuff like that. And it really, really helps grow the show, get us cooler guests, have cooler conversations, and it helps everything so much. So if you don't mind, thank you so much. Let's get back to it. This is very interesting. So I'm just going to pose a hypothetical. Different versions of this kind of thing have happened, and you can kind of shed some more specific details. But it's something that I never thought about that I'll kind of pose to the audience and see how they feel about it. So let's say there's a construction crew that's doing some construction, and all of a sudden they uncover some bones. And these bones, they report them to the police. The police then realizes, oh, this is not a crime scene. This is an ancient burial site. What do? They might call it a local university, and anthropologists and archaeologists might come out. They will uncover the bones, and they realize these bones are 1,000 years old. Wow, this is a huge scientific discovery. These are now skeletal remains found in a very specific place, and they invite all these anthropologists out to go research them, and they're doing research, and they're finding out interesting things about the bones. And then all of a sudden they get a call from a Native American tribe. And they say, hey, you've uncovered and dug up one of our ancestors. We need those bones back. That is a very, very interesting ethical question, Should the researchers honor the request of the Native Americans and say, you're completely right, these bones are belonging to you, these are ancient bones that have been here since before, colonization or anything like that, we will return these to you and you can bury them in the way that you see fit? Or is it in the best interest of science and scientific progression for the anthropologists and the researchers at hand to have access to those remains and anything that's around the burial site in order to advance our understanding of human evolution and human biology? This is a very interesting debate, and a lot of the controversy that you've been involved with has dealt with this specific issue. So they've passed a law called NAGPRA that basically requires scientists, anthropologists specifically, to return skeletal remains to the tribes in which they belong. Is this a pretty fair assessment of kind of a hypothetical that could have happened or has happened before?
Yes, absolutely. Actually, it's happened multiple times. One of the things that people don't realize about American archaeology is that most of the collections are actually what we call salvage sites. And salvage sites are sites that are discovered when construction happens, or when construction is planned, like the roads, right? The highways, and basically the option is bulldoze over them, right? Or excavate. And since pretty much the 1940s, maybe even going back to the 1930s, we've had what we call salvage archaeology that has taken the position that, and funded by the government, by the way, that has taken the position that these remains and artifacts that are being uncovered are too valuable to just bulldoze over, and that we are doing a service by excavating and then researching the remains. NAGPRA, which is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, is a law that was passed in 1990 that says if those remains and artifacts, sacred artifacts, funerary goods, belong to a modern-day tribe, if there is a connection, what they would call an affiliation, and the holders of the collection receive federal funding, like universities, even private universities receive federal funding, or museums, then it is they are obligated to return those remains. One of the things that NAGPRA also allowed for was continued curation of the remains, so that some remains would not be given back because they were not affiliated or could not be affiliated with modern tribes. So not every tribe that is around now is very old, for example. Not every tribe that was around 1,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago, if you look at some of the Paleo-Indians, is around now. Some tribes have moved, merged, died out. Was invasions from other groups. So, for example, the Ryan Mound collection at San Jose State University, where I work, it's a large collection that spans about 2,000, 2,500 years in time. And what we find is if you look at the skull and you look at the cranial traits, that the oldest part of that collection belonged to a different people than the most recent part. And that there's a lot of violence, a lot of evidence of violence in that collection. So arrowheads in the bones, broken noses, bumps on the head, so forth. And this is evidence that one tribe was being invaded by another, most likely from the Ryan Mound is from the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area. And there was an invasion probably from the southeast into that region for resources, and they wiped out the earlier tribe. So should we give the remains that we find to a tribe that is just in the region, even if they had no connection to it? I would say not. And how NAGPRA was written initially in 1990, it allowed for curation of those unaffiliated remains. Now, NAGPRA hasn't been rewritten, but has added regulations and fine-tuning over the years. And every time they've made a change, it has been made to chip away at these collections that are still in museums and universities. The tribal activists, repatriation activists, they do not like the concept that some collections cannot be associated with modern day tribes. And that's for multiple reasons that they don't like it. One is because it assumes that that they replaced people before them and therefore are no better than the Europeans who came after them.
I see.
But then the other thing is that there's money involved with land, land grants and access to land. And they want to also be able to control the narrative. So many tribes don't like the narrative that there was a lot of violence in the past. And so if you're talking about one tribe wiping out another, that's suggesting that there was violence.
I mean, is that controversial though? My assumption was always that native tribes were fierce warriors, and that they, like all other people groups all around the world, would be at war with other people groups near them. So is that a controversial opinion? It's
not necessarily controversial in the general, but when you get to each tribe, each local community, oftentimes it's controversial.
It's okay to say that there was generally violence, but if you say this tribe, wiped out and genocided this tribe, that's where they would be uncomfortable.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
And other factors too that sometimes are not controversial, but other times are. For example, many tribes owned slaves. And that shouldn't be controversial to say. Slavery was a universal practice for much of human prehistory and some of history, right? But it paints a different picture on the Americas if you say, well, the Cherokees before the Europeans ever came in had slaves. And so then they'll kind of finagle it as, well, they weren't really the same type of slaves. They were war slaves. And I'm like, well, I don't know if there's any good type of slave.
Right. I do wonder if sometimes people bring up those arguments as a way to kind of justify the genocide of Native Americans, right? I do think people sometimes will say like, oh, well, they were killing each other, so it's okay that we killed them, or they had slaves, so their genocide was inevitable. I sometimes think people make bad faith arguments like that.
I actually think that there was no genocide, because a genocide, and I would even say intertribally, there's a genocide includes intent to exterminate a person based on their race or their genes or their ethnicity, and I don't think that really happened in that case. Now, like Nazi Germany, that was genocide, or like the Rwanda, right? But because there was also intent, so there's huge debates about how many Native Americans were in North America when the Europeans arrived. And if you accept some of the best evidence, it really looks like there was more like about 2.5 million in the whole of, the continental U.S. And so that makes it much more, makes it a much less outrageous argument that people thought that most of the U.S. was empty, because most of it was empty. And then, of course, there was war when they interacted. I'm not saying there wasn't, but that's very different than we got to this land and we're going to wipe out everybody else who was there. I don't think that happened. And even the accusations of bio war, right? Obviously, when the Europeans came over and they brought some diseases that the Native Americans hadn't been exposed to, that caused harm. But in the same token, when the Europeans came over and they were exposed to some diseases that that they hadn't been exposed to, that caused harm, right? So it goes both ways. And if you look at, for example, the argument about syphilis, whether we oftentimes hear that Columbus brought tuberculosis to the New World, or smallpox to the New World, but the other side of it is that Columbus brought back something not very nice, and that was syphilis.
Oh, interesting.
It goes both ways. And so in a sense, I think that when the data is the data. And if somebody tries to use it to justify that, that doesn't change what the data is. And the data does not support that there were 20 million Native Americans and then wiped out to about 1.5 million. There was a huge drop in population likely with the onset of agriculture. Not right away, but what agriculture did was it was a good idea because basically it provided a constant food source, but it then allowed populations to grow and settle in and get denser, and that helps spread diseases. And so then we see a dip in population size, and then they recover from that and increase again. But this happened before any Europeans arrived.
Right, yeah. Like
so,
pre-colonized Native Americans were agrarian.
Yeah, well, they weren't all agrarian. Some of them were, right? So if you think about, and that's another aspect of it, is that they were widespread in many areas and had very different lifestyles. So, for example, there were the agriculturalists in the south east, but the Californians never adopted agriculture, and they don't really get to be into agriculture until it's introduced to them, because there was, especially like if you consider like the Bay Area Californians, in that central California, was so rich of resources, there was no reason to adopt agriculture. Interestingly, they were already kind of sedentary because there were so many resources.
Oh, wow.
And their health profile looked quite a lot like agricultural Native Americans, because they had a staple food, which was acorns. And so their teeth had some of the same wear patterns as some of the agriculturalists.
Oh, interesting.
And so
they found like basically like a natural like agricultural society that was just already bubbling that they just walked into, and they said, okay, we'll settle here. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I do actually think that's an important distinction. I don't think it's fair to say that all Native people or all Native Americans in the United States are a monolith. And I do that a lot. And I think a lot of people will do that. Well, they say, well, Native Americans did blank, which is obviously as preposterous as saying like, oh, Asians do blank, or, white people do blank. It is, it's a generalization that, maybe there's like some semblance of truth on like the very broad end, but it really ignores a lot of the specificity and nuance of each individual tribe and each different people group.
And I suspect that whenever you see something that is universal, that it's universal not only for Native Americans, but it's just a human trait.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Maybe slightly different, with a different spice and different people, but it's a human trait.
Right, exactly. And in the way that, people in America today are culturally different, people in Florida, where I grew up, are very different than people in California, and some of the cultural habits that we pick up.
Right.
There are things that are different, and I think that would probably go for, pre-colonial times with Native people in America, that the Floridian tribes and the, Bay Area tribes probably eat different food, and they, hunt in different ways, and they have different traditions and customs. And to assume that they are one singular monolith is probably a disservice.
Yeah. And I also think that it's anthropologists, including myself, do this thing that we often paint a generalist picture of either at the tribal level or at the site level or at the country level. And one of the things I enjoyed most in my career is looking at individuals in the collection, because I actually think that when we reconstruct the past, we often talk about groups like the hunter-gatherers versus the agriculturalists, or the men versus the women, right? But individuals existed, and I'm sure that they had individual lives,
right?
And sometimes disagreed with their tribal members, right? Maybe had neighborhood fights, right? Family disagreements, things like that. And so one of the things I would do from the Ryan Mound is I would go through this collection often to ensure that it was being curated well, so taken care of. So if bags were breaking, I'd rebag things. If the boxes looked like they needed to be replaced, they'd be replaced, things like that. And if I came across an interesting skeleton, I would try to tell that skeleton's story as if he or she was an individual. And I had a couple of them that I did that I really enjoyed doing. One was several years ago, and it was a male who had severe arthritis of the jaw. So the joint from the jaw to the bottom of the skull, the temporomandibular joint. So severe arthritis of the jaw. And also had a little tiny, on the cranium, a like a mother of pearl piece on his skull.
Wow.
So I suspect that was a part of a bigger, wearing something, that he wore something bigger, and that was what remained. Maybe the other part was made out of hide or, something that doesn't preserve. And so that preserved, and dirt had caked it on. But I suspect it was something more.
Like a headdress or something.
Headdress, right. And I looked at this individual, and what I found was that he was also buried with thousands of little beads, more beads than pretty much anyone in this collection. So, and these beads were probably strung up as jewelry, but the fact that he had such a high number suggested something special to me. And I could imagine that the arthritis on the jawbone, which is not found in any of the other individuals of that site, and the wear pattern on his teeth, coupled with the remainder of the headdress and the thousands of shells, I suspect he might have been somebody like a artisan, somebody who valued those kind of things, and who his people valued for his arts, and that's maybe why he was buried differently. So kind of a really putting some meat on the bones, so to speak, to try to tell the story. Now, I could be wrong.
And what do you account for the mandibular arthritis?
Working the sinew through his teeth.
Oh, interesting.
That would be used to then bead these shells.
Oh, interesting. That's an interesting
theory. It's very similar to the dental pattern is very similar to that.
Interesting.
So yeah. So I think that's a very, fun thing to do, but it also brings back the point that the past people were individuals as well.
That's interesting. So this is the kind of work that you're doing. I think it's a great example of the type of research that anthropologists every day are doing. They're looking at skeletal remains, and they're trying to draw conclusions based off what they understand, collections of skeletal remains to be, to then understand cultures better. So now if a native group or a tribe came to you and said, hey, you dug up our skeleton and our beads and, all of our artifacts, we want them back. Your position pretty publicly has been, you don't believe that they should have a legal right to repossess, or that you would have to necessarily turn over those remains. Is that fair to say? It's
fair to say. I would say that NAGPRA was written as a compromise. And the compromise was that the Native Americans who could show affiliation to the remains should have the remains back. And that where unaffiliated remains were, that those would be retained, curated, and researched.
And how do you prove affiliation?
And so NAGPRA was written that affiliation could be proved with through a preponderance of evidence, which is like, a little more than 50%, right?
Sure.
51%. And using pretty much everything available. DNA, metrics, like cranial metrics, artifacts, historic documents, oral tradition. So everything on the plate, geography, and see, is there affiliation? And so when NAGPRA first came out, I was, in 1990, I was still a high school student, was I? Yes. But I grew up, in a sense, into a scholar with NAGPRA being pretty much the whole, throughout my whole career. And even though it has safeguards like that, I could see very early on that these safeguards would not protect unaffiliated remains. And part of that stems from the fact that NAGPRA also violates the separation of church and state in a couple of ways. One of the ways is that it requires 2 traditional Indian religious leaders to be on any committee. So, and that's a violation of church and state, because basically the First Amendment says that the government shall not establish or prefer any one religion. And by saying that those 2 members have to be traditional Indian religious leaders is a preference for that religion. So they're not saying, two Native Americans who are religious leaders. They want a specific religious leader. And so that's problematic. And it's problematic because that allowed creation myths and origin stories that are creation myths to be entered into evidence and treated like fact. And that's one of the reasons why I wrote Repatriation and Erasing the Past, is with an attorney, now retired attorney, James W. Springer, to try to tease out this problem and show how NAGPRA went wrong from the very beginning with that. And it's interesting that although many people don't realize this, that NAGPRA was supported by many religious groups because they saw the writing on the wall. So like Baptist Women of America and the Mennonites and the Amish, and like they all supported NAGPRA because they saw it as a religious law, and they were right.
Interesting.
And I thought that this would lead to problems down the road. And then the other thing is, early on in my career, I had a couple other big stories broke that made me realize, yes, my suspicion of NAGPRA and where it's going is right on. And I don't get everything right, but this time I did. And one of those things was Kennewick Man.
Okay.
Kennewick Man is about 9,000 years old. You can, if you look up the dates on Google, you'll get everything from like 8,400 to 9,400 because of calibrations and so forth.
And this is a skeletal.
It's a skeleton that was found eroding out of a riverbank in Kennewick, Washington. First thought to be a homicide victim. They called in Jim Chatters, the police called in Jim Chatters to investigate it. Jim Chatters is a forensic anthropologist. And this doesn't look like a Native American remains. And he then took an x-ray of the remains. They x-rayed the bones, and they found an obsidian flake embedded, so an obsidian arrowhead embedded into his hip bone. Wow. And he was like, the last time this happened to somebody wasn't just a few years ago, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, it was a homicide.
So, yeah. Well, he didn't actually die from that, right?
Oh, really?
He died. They don't really know. He had a lot of injuries. But we know he didn't die from that because there was bone grown over it.
Oh, interesting.
So it was healed. But he was shot in the hip or buttocks, And as soon as that discovery was made and turned out to be old, 8,000 to 9,000 years old, the Native Americans around that region said, this is our ancient one. He belongs to us. We want him back. And the government stepped in. They took Kennewick Man away from access to anthropologists. They buried the site with tons and tons of gravel to make sure nobody else was excavating there. And then a group of anthropologists bravely sued to get access to Kennewick Man. And a lawsuit that took years. I don't know, maybe by the time they got access to him, maybe it was 8 years or so. Finally, the judge did rule in the favor of the anthropologists, granting them access. There's an excellent book on Kennewick Man. It's about all the research that was done on him. And when I was doing my PhD at the University of Arkansas, the government had hired a group of scientists to study Kennewick Man to determine whether Kennewick Man should be given to the Native Americans or not. And one of the scientists who was on that group was Jeremy Rose, who is a professor of archaeology at University of Arkansas, where I was doing my PhD at the time. This was like 97 maybe. And no, 98. And basically, I got to look at the CT scans of Kennewick Man's leg bones and his measurements, the metrics of his leg bones. And he was really robust, like the type of robusticity that you saw only in pre-Ice Age populations.
Oh, wow.
So he was very robust. And he didn't look like Native Americans later on. Now, some people say, he looked Caucasian or Caucasoid. He doesn't really look that way either. He's kind of a mix, but he definitely does not look like the Native Americans from, let's say, 3,000 years old, right? And so what happened was the tribes who were eager to bury Kennewick Man, the Umatillas, for example, and the Colvilles, they had initially said, we're not for DNA research. But then I believe that because the scientists had won the right to study Kennewick Man, they did do DNA research on him. And the first tests just didn't work, right? But as DNA research got better and methods improved, they did figure out his DNA. And when his DNA was published, which was, the results came out like maybe in like 2015
Oh, wow.
or so something like that. I might have the date a little wrong. It's the lead author was Rasmussen, and published in Nature or Science. And what they found was that Kennewick Man was most like the South American Indians, not the North American Indians, genetically, which suggests that maybe his people didn't come over the land bridge.
Maybe his people did
not come over the land bridge, but came from the south and came up instead of came over and down, right?
That makes sense.
And my position on the peopling of the Americas is there were probably lots of migrations over. I think that the Bering Strait over from Alaska did occur, but I don't think it was the only passage. So I think that there's good evidence that they might have come along the coast on boats that would not preserve, like reed boats, and dipping into the coast because that area was never frozen over. And that would have been rich resources. I just think that in all likelihood, there were probably multiple migrations.
Interesting. So for Kennewick Man, do you think that migration was people groups going to South America on boat from Africa?
Could be from, or he could have come over from like Japan area, Asia. But not going over west, but going east.
Interesting. Is there like some type of plausible evidence that they would have access to that type of seafaring at that time?
Well, I think perhaps the best plausible evidence is that people got to Australia about 50, 60,000 years ago, and Australia was not landlocked.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a good point. I never think about that.
But, what happened after the DNA was published was the report was written up, and it said there's a connection between Kennewick Man and the Colville tribe. And therefore, it should go into the ground. Therefore, Kennewick Man should go into the ground. There's a connection. But we're all connected. So to say that, there's a connection should not be good enough. It should be the closest connection. And Kennewick Man's closest connection was South America, not the Northwest. And so I think that it's very problematic to make these decisions based on a political interpretation of the data, I would say. And another part of that is, once that DNA was found to have any connection with the Colville tribe, they buried him. That was the end of the story. And DNA research is quite interesting. And I'm not a molecular anthropologist, but I've taught these kinds of topics in my field, so I read a lot about them. One of the things is that you can get they're not false positives, but they're exaggerated connections if your database is shallow. So if you don't have enough data points, not enough tribes, for example, that gave data, then the tribe that did will look very much closer than if 100 tribes did and you're comparing them, right? So it's just not enough data. And the only way to get more data is more time and more collection of data, and that modern people have to donate their DNA. So
this is very interesting.
It's very, and that Kennewick Man did in large part shape my hardening against NAGPRA. But there were other things. For example, and this is not NAGPRA, but when I was doing my data collection up in Canada at the Canadian Museum of Civilization, and this was during my PhD data collection, and while I was there, the Haida, which are a group of Native Americans on the northwest coast, they were doing a repatriation of collections from the museum. And once they had done all the repatriation and taken all the skeletal remains, everything done and dusted, and they did their ceremony, they're out of the museum. A few days later, the curator got a phone call from the tribal representatives and said, we want you to give us the casts and destroy, because we're going to destroy those as well. So when people say, why don't you just scan the bones, 3D print them, and then study those? There's problems with that. But even if there weren't problems with that, it doesn't matter, because once the bones are collected, they will then come for the casts. Because it's not only about burying remains, it's about an ideology that says it's our story to tell, and we don't want you to have any data to use to tell that story. And we're going to tell that story in a way where we look good, we were here first, and we never came over from anywhere. We evolved here, or we not evolved, but we were created here by the Supreme Being. And all of this is why NAGPRA doesn't work. And now, throughout the time, this has been creeping in. And now the latest regulations, which are in sync with Biden's indigenous knowledge push, say that when there's a difference of opinion, then you must defer to Native American traditional Indian knowledge, traditional knowledge. So if there's a disagreement, you can't say which is a better evidence. You can't say, well, let's get a third opinion. It's like, then you have to defer to the Native American expert witness.
Interesting. What's up, guys? We're going to take a break really quick because it's 2024 and it's time to talk about something important. When you are seriously hurt, your injury could be worth millions. Yes, that's right. The world is a crazy place, and one person's negligence can result in another's settlement. And that's why I got to talk to you about Morgan & Morgan. Morgan & Morgan is America's largest injury law firm. They have over 100 offices nationwide and over 1,000 lawyers. Yes, these are the big boys. You know them, you see their billboards all over the world. If you ever drove down I-90 from Florida to New York, I'm telling you, you've seen the billboards, all right? Have you ever watched a UFC fight? You've seen them right on the banner. I'm telling you, these are the biggest guys in the game, all right? With over $20 billion recovered for over 500,000 clients, Morgan & Morgan has a proven track record of fighting to get you full and fair compensation. The annoying thing with most attorneys is that in order to submit a claim, you got to call them up, you got to talk to their people, you got to go back and forth on emails, you got to hope that they see it. They might charge you just to even look at their claim. Here's the cool thing with Morgan & Morgan. With 8 clicks or less, you can submit a claim and one of their licensed attorneys will take a look at it and get back to you. It's that easy. It's like ordering something off Amazon. It's just a couple clicks. You can submit your claim very easily and cheap. Yeah, how about $0? That's how much it costs to submit a claim with Morgan & Morgan. Extremely easy, no fee required. So if you are ever injured, you can go check out Morgan & Morgan. Their fee is free unless they win. That's right, unless they win for you. Unless they fight and get you compensation, you're not paying a single dollar. That's a pretty good deal. So for more information, go to forthepeople.com/Gagnon. That's correct, forthepeople.com/Gagnon, or dial pound law, that's pound 529 from your cell phone. That's for the people, forthepeople.com/Gagnon, or dial pound law, pound 529 from your cell phone. This is a paid advertisement. Now let's get back to the show after this short disclaimer. So I'm sure there's people that are wondering, okay, well, Dr. Weiss, why does one skeleton matter? You find the Kennewick Man, why do you need that one? Can't you just let them have that one skeleton? What would you say to that?
I would say that with Paleo-Indians, and Paleo-Indians are in native remains that are anything 7,500 years or older. There are so few of them that each one of them adds to the knowledge of these earliest Americans. So in some cases where there are thousands of the skeletons, you could say, well, yeah, that might be true. But in the case of Paleo-Indians, where we only have about a dozen, then everyone counts. But the other reason why not to say, well, okay, you can have that one, but I'm keeping this one, is because that's not where they're going to stop. And one of the interesting things about NAGPRA is that NAGPRA actually has done its job. 91.5% of affiliated remains have been repatriated. That left many unaffiliated collections. And if it had stopped there, sure, we lost a lot, but we had still much, and it would have been a compromise. I think it's sad for every skeleton to be buried, but I would understand that, and I'd say, okay, this compromise worked. But that's not what happened. Almost everything is repatriated that is closely affiliated. And in the last set of regulations, what they've decided was that they were going to get rid of the term unidentified affiliation.
And what does that mean,
culturally unidentified? That means you can't say that there are remains that don't belong to modern tribes, that everything is affiliated to some modern tribe. And that's just not true. It's just a lie in order to increase repatriation and reburial. And so I think that that's the problem. Now, you could look at things where you have a clear affiliation or clear family relationship.
I'm curious about that. Let's say they uncover a very traditional ceremonial burial grave of the Navajo, and they're able to look at this and they say the artifacts buried here are very close to traditional modern Navajo.
And I think that's what they were thinking of when they passed. That's what anthropologists were thinking of when they passed NAGPRA.
Right. So let's say they found that case.
And I think that if it had stayed that way, we could have saved the science.
Okay.
And I'll give a good example of where I think a reburial or repatriation was actually a good thing. Sitting Bull's great-grandson said he wanted Sitting Bull's scalp, and I think artifact too. And he said, this is family. This is I want this back in our family. And they asked him for a DNA test, and they tested the scalp and him, and lo and behold, it was the great-grandson, and they gave it back. I think that's clearly an affiliation. Mm-hmm. That's clearly a link. And I say, if it was my grandson, my great-grandfather, I wouldn't want it back unless I wanted it to keep as research, but I wouldn't want it back to bury or, that's just not what I would want to do with skeletal remains or so. Mm-hmm. But I can see that as being legitimate.
What was Sitting Bull's remains, like his scalp and the artifact? Was it in a kind of collection? I see.
I think it was in the Smithsonian.
Okay.
So I'm pretty sure it was Smithsonian, but I could be wrong.
That seems pretty reasonable to me. If my grandfather was in a museum somewhere, I would, and it was against my will, I would wish I had the right to say, hey, I would like to do with what I want to do with my family's remains.
And I see that, and yes. And when that story first broke, there was a photo of the great-grandson, and I said to my sister, I can't believe they're even bothering to do a DNA test because he looks exactly like him.
That's hilarious.
So I do think that there are times where you can say, well, yes, this is a clear connection in, but for many cases, it's not. Mm. And as I said, most of those cases, even less affiliation, have been repatriated. It's just never going to be enough to those people whose concern is not about the remains and artifacts, but whose concern is about not allowing science to tell the story. One of the committee members that Bill Clinton appointed to NAGPRA committee members, for example, his response in regards to the people in the Americas and his tribe was, we didn't come across no land bridge. We've always been here. And maybe they didn't come across land bridge, but, the thing was he was saying it as no one did because Native Americans started in America and didn't come from somewhere else, which just is just not true.
Is that a native religious belief?
It's a religious belief
in some specific tribes
that, and pretty much every tribe that I've read about.
They believe that they were always in this place, that their creator, God, put them specifically in this land.
And it's quite interesting. Every NAGPRA meeting starts and ends with a prayer. So I think that if it was any other religion, anthropologists would be like up in arms. Well, maybe not any other religion, but if it was Christian fundamentalists, they would be up in arms. And rightfully so. They'd be like, you can't introduce religion into this, but because there's kind of a deference to Native American religion, and oftentimes I'm told, well, it's not really the same. I don't see how you can argue that it's not the same. It's a religious belief about a supernatural beginning. It's a creation myth.
Now, do you think that, so I guess the closest capacity would be like if there was a direct ancestor that they could be able to repatriate those remains. What if it is something where it's not necessarily a direct ancestor that they can test with DNA necessarily, but they're able to say like, oh, this is maybe a 300 or 400-year-old, skeletal remain. Where would you classify your belief on that?
I would say that the links would be too weak, in my opinion.
Okay.
But NAGPRA wouldn't, right?
Sure.
So, most of the remains that are now in museums and universities are pre-contact. Most of them are thousands of years old, not hundreds. And this is the links are very weak.
Now, I had read some stories that are a little bit more appalling, I guess, personally, where there was like a burial site that was uncovered, and this group was basically charging people to go see it, and there was like a fee to go see the burial site, and then they eventually closed it down. But effectively, there was like a native burial site that then they were kind of charging a fee as like a tourist attraction.
Right.
A lot of the bones were kind of like looted and things like that. Do you know that specific case that I'm speaking about?
I don't.
Okay.
I wonder if you mean the White Sands.
Maybe. I have a reference on my phone. I might just pull it up really quick just for the sake of the convo.
And looting is very destructive to the science of anthropology. Yet people kind of confound excavation with looting sometimes. And looting tends to be not related to the science. That's
Right.
not to say that there weren't, grave robbers in the past, and obviously
Right. That's
these
criminal.
kinds of things shouldn't happen in the future. It's but looting has happened for thousands of years. Native Americans looted other Native American graves. They also desecrated graves of their enemies when there was tribal warfare. So this kind of thing happens. Looting happened in Pharaonic Egypt. So I see that as distinctly different from scientific research and
Right.
Yeah,
I
discovery.
think that's fair. That's fair. And I think that the term looting should be sort of prescribed specifically for events where there's private individual covertly stealing items for their own personal gain.
Yeah.
That makes sense. So this is a example that I just found just in my research in Salina, Kansas. I believe Salina, Kansas. There was a family that excavated a 600-year-old cemetery of Native American belonging to the Pawnee Nation and charged tourists to see the 146 open graves. The tourist site operated for 50 years, not until closing in 1989. And they spoke about the Pawnee Nation spoke about their that they desire to not have their remains be photographed,
Right.
and things like that. So like in an example like that, how are you familiar with that example?
It sounds slightly familiar, but again, I think that this is very different from research.
Okay. So in this case, would you look at this and say that would be egregious to try to use it as like a tourist attraction and make a distinction between tourism and research?
I don't think it's necessarily egregious to use skeletal remains as a tourist attraction. Body Worlds is a tourist attraction. The Mutta Museum is a tourist attraction. The catacombs are tourist attractions.
That's a good point.
Right? So I don't think that is necessarily egregious. There are lots of examples. I think the problem arises when you don't have a desire to curate or to protect the remains and the artifacts in a way for future generations. And so if it is a tourist attraction that is done in a way where the remains are not protected and therefore being perhaps destroyed through time because they're out of the ground and maybe some people are stealing something.
Or people are touching them repeatedly. And
well, touching is not that big of an issue.
Oh, really? That wouldn't like erode it or?
No, it's like, but like if people are, spilling stuff on them or trampling on them, yeah. But I mean, the anthropologists touch the remains all the time.
Sure. But I always assume that would be like with gloves or some sort of like protection.
Actually, the National Park Service, and I got into one of the big issues that I had was I took a photograph of me holding a skull, which the university never had a problem with until my 2020 book. And they're like, oh, she's holding it without gloves. And most anthropologists will not hold remains with gloves because it's slippery and you're more likely to drop them. And even the National Park Service advises against the use of gloves. We're not dealing with a forensic site where you're protecting the material from, you don't want to get a fingerprint on it, right? And even with DNA, you're taking the DNA either from the mastoid deep inside of the skull or from the tooth, but a tooth that's cut open and scraping out the dentin. So even the DNA is not an issue. And so that's really not an issue. It's more an issue of whether people are going to be maybe stealing something or trampling on something or spilling something, things like that. Or a car driving over something, the animal, a pet dog getting loose and taking a bone. Sure. Those are the kinds of things.
Yeah. What's up, guys? We're going to take a break really quick because we got to talk about your amazing dick game. Yes, you right now, listen to my voice, my deep, soothing voice. You have an amazing dick game. Or maybe you know someone with an amazing dick game. Maybe you got a boyfriend. Who knows? But if you have an amazing dick game, there's a way that you can make it better. And that's with the good people over at Blue Chew. Blue Chew is an amazing service that basically delivers a chewable tablet that has the same active ingredients as Viagra, Cialis, all that stuff, but this is the chew. It's at a fraction of a cost, and it's never been easier to get your hands on the greatest dick game of your life. Never been easier. I'm telling you. You can go to bluechew.com and you can submit all your information to a licensed person, a legit person that will then mail you a discreet, very unassuming, but very, very powerful package. You know what I'm talking about? The powerful package to your home. That's how easy it is. You don't got to go talk to a doctor and be like, I want, nope, easy. You got to just go on the internet, bluechew.com. I want to get the best dick given of my life. And that's how you do it. Easy as that. And for the listeners of this show, of this program, you are going to get free first month of Blue Chew. You're going to be getting Blue Chew for free. All you got to do is pay $5 shipping. That's a cup of coffee. Black to be delivering that BBC. You know what I'm saying? That's bluechew.com, BLUECHEW.com. Use the promo code GAGNON, GAGNON, and receive your first month for free. That's bluechew.com for more details and important safety information. And thank you so much, Blue Chew. I'm telling you, man, check out this product. Even if you're one of these people that's like, I don't know, I don't really need it. What are you talking about? It could be better. It can always be better. Let's say you're in the 1%, you're about to be in the 0.01% with Blue Chew. Now let's get back to the show. Is there any grounds, I guess, for working in a negotiation with any of the tribes or any of the native peoples to say, hey, look, this remnant that we found, we can't necessarily prove that it directly relates to you and your people, but they feel strongly about it, and say, hey, look, can we do a compromise? Can we research this for X period of time? Or can it stay in your possession or not on display in a museum? But if we need to research it, we can petition and work on it that way. Is it possible to make some type of amicable compromise? There
are a lot of collaborative efforts. And in a sense, for years, we had a MOU with the tribes at at San Jose.
What's an MOU?
A memorandum of understanding that research was allowed. However, as soon as my book was known and I made the newspaper for my views, they broke their MOU. They said, we don't want her in the collection anymore. They had no problem with it whatsoever beforehand. And so I think that one of the problems is that you know, they talk a lot about you have to trust people. Well, the anthropologists have to be able to trust as well. And almost all collaborative efforts that I have seen have required steps that I personally would not be comfortable with. So let me give you a handful of examples. Changing conclusions to fit a oral history narrative. Or if the data shows something unflattering to the tribe, not publishing it. Holding field schools or lab sessions with requirements that when women are menstruating, that they don't go in. I mean, these kinds of things are just things.
What is the last one?
Menstruating women are not allowed in labs or on fields work with many tribes. Many tribes have menstrual taboos. And so I'm not going to...
That one I agree with. That one's a good one.
I'm not going to say, okay, all you female students, are you on your period? Because if you are, you cannot go in and collect data. But not only that, you cannot get close to any of the Native Americans because you may contaminate them. And you can't. And if we're in field school, you have to eat in a separate area. This is absurd, and I won't collaborate with those kinds of ideals.
Wow.
And so I think that collaboration sounds good on the surface, but when you're working with people who are basically religious fanatics, you're not going to be able to collaborate with them in real scientific ways.
Interesting. I think that's an interesting nuance to your point that you don't necessarily, I guess, and I want to make that distinction just very clear. You don't personally have a, like ethno-supremacist view of Native people or Native Americans. You have a personal issue with religious extremism. So hypothetically, let's say you were researching somewhere in Pennsylvania and you found, some bones that maybe were 400 or 500 years old, and you were able to confirm that they were from early settlers in the area and they were Caucasoid and they were actually maybe like early Amish settlers, or maybe they're Quaker or something like that. Yeah. And you were able to look at them and you said, wow, this is a great, interesting piece of information. And the Amish came to you and said, well, Dr. Weiss, those are our ancestors. Would any part of your, position on this issue change at all?
Yeah, no, I mean, it wouldn't. Basically, if those Amish would also require me to jump through hoops to be able to collect the data and to work with them, I wouldn't.
If the Amish said, look, we don't, I don't know necessarily Amish rules, but if they said, hey, women can't, do research on this.
You have to do your research by candlelight. Right. I don't know. But, and I think that's very much a step too far. And it's discriminatory, and it's discriminatory in a way that I would think that anthropologists should say, you know what, we're not going to follow these regulations. If you want to work with us, we have to treat people as equals, and that means that we're not going to ask women to, if they're on their period, and then shun them for the time, but we're also not going to say, okay, there's something really interesting down that area of the site, but that's a sacred area, and so therefore we're not going to research that. And we're also not going to change our results because it conflicts with your religion. We have to be true to the science and true to our ideals of equality, of treatment of people.
So I guess if there was a Christian young earth creationist that, they had remains on their property or something like that, and you wanted to go look at the remains, and they said, no, we're not going to let you look at them because we understand your work to be evolutionary, right, and we are young earth creationists, and we believe that you're going to try to paint a picture against what we believe. In, I guess, like modern, civil discourse, is there any precedent for something like that you could potentially sue to get access to those remains?
Yeah, I'm not. It depends on what land it is. If it's private land, even private lands that are, if you find other things on private lands, they're private lands.
Right, you would need a warrant, I guess, to go through that.
So I think that's one of the issues. But the other thing is, anthropologists have been excellent at kind of fighting back against this young earth creationist or creation, intelligent design, and so forth. And when I became an anthropologist, I thought this was because it was against the scientific view. I thought they were against viewing data through a religious lens, and that they would be as critical to any religious narrative. And I found out that that's not the case, that they don't look at religious narratives from Native Americans with the same skepticism. And that's very problematic for me. And so I grew up as an atheist. I don't know, whether that means I'm missing the God gene. And I have no problem if people are religious. I just don't think that they should push their religion onto our science.
Right.
And I wouldn't go into a church and say, oh, no, you can't say this, or, let me correct you. And I don't pretend to know the Bible. So I have no problem with people's religious practices, anything like that. I just have a problem when it comes into the research. And I even say, I have no problem, of course, if there are scientists who are religious. It's about whether their practices are impacting my life and other people who do not believe, or do not believe in the same things that they believe, and whether it's impacting our ability to conduct research.
Interesting. So it's really a church and state argument at its core. So hypothetically, just another hypothetical, I don't know if this has happened. Let's say there is a native tribe, and on maybe a piece of federal land, there is a burial site, and it is a big tomb. And maybe it's some type of pyramid or something that they made, and they said, this is the founding member of our tribe from 1,000 years ago. Let's say they said, that's who this is our guy. If, let's say, a researcher or an anthropologist like yourself thought, oh, there might be interesting artifacts that we could uncover, or interesting information or understanding about early peoples in America if we uncover this tomb, do you think that you have a legal right, or an ethical right to go into that tomb and excavate it against the wishes of the native people that know that it's there and have a claim to it? Like, how would you discern that?
I would say that you would take the same steps as if you are doing repatriation. You determine whether it is actually there, if they are actually linked to that monument.
But in order to do that, you would have to dig up the...
Not necessarily. I mean, if you're talking about a site that's visible, so, the construction of it, the location, any documentation, historic documents that show the tribe was there for when first encountered, so there are other ways to investigate that. I
see. So let's say in this hypothetical, you're able to confirm and say, okay, it looks like these people, 1,000 years ago were responsible for the burial of this chief. In that case, what would be your personal belief on that example?
Well, my personal belief would be that it would still be very interesting to figure out what's in that place. But this is not, I think there's a distinct difference between starting an excavation and returning something that has been excavated. So I think that most excavations, as we started off, are salvage sites.
Right,
And
which I
that
think is an important distinction.
Yeah. And so when we have a non-salvage site, there are quite a few safeguards to protect the site and to allow kind of a combination of archaeology and monument preservation, for example, because it's, even if you don't believe in the religion, like, for example, I don't have to be religious to look at the Great Pyramids of Giza and think that they're fantastic, or church, right? So in that sense, that's about preservation. So I do think that there's a lot of nuance in there and distinctions that need to be there for those reasons.
That makes sense. That's interesting. Now, can you explain why there is so much like social pressure and kind of like tiptoeing and special, I guess, permissions that you believe are granted to Native American religions and not to, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, things like that?
Well, I think that part of it is the postmodern narrative of there is no objective truth, and that the people who should be telling the story are the victims, and there are oppressors and those people who were oppressed, and that's postmodernism in a nutshell, right? And so in a sense, I would say that it's a part of that. And anthropology has embraced postmodernism, and so that's part of it. The other part is that I wouldn't, although anthropologists are most deferent to Native American religions, I think that they are also sympathetic to other non-Western religions like Islam. And so you'll have like anthropology departments celebrating World Hijab Day, with Wear a Hijab Day events and so forth. And so that is also part of the postmodern narrative, I think, where it's the Muslims are viewed upon as victims, victims of the West, victims of perhaps Judaism. And so it fits along there. It's interesting how these things, how much of what we commonly refer to as the woke agenda is really based or can be seen as part of this postmodern movement that happened in academia, where you get rid of the concept of objective truth and objective knowledge. And if you think of science, science is basically the search for the truth. You may never get there, and your truth may be overturned, but it's like using data to try to figure out what really happened or how to really explain the natural world. That's science. And postmodernism is saying that this is not the way to go about understanding things. The way to go about understanding things is to look at the world as a oppressor-oppressed dynamic with victims, and there's no truth, and therefore we should let the victims tell the story.
Yeah, I guess trying to examine power at the intersection of every interaction.
And so you get the decolonization movement and the decolonization movement, the anti-settler colonialization, and those kinds of things too. And that explains some of this anti-binary sex movement, things like that too.
That makes sense. Do you think that there's any claim for, I guess, Native Americans? Like, is there any caveat that you would put out? I guess, we spoke before. I was asking does every Native American hate you? Right? Like, that was kind of a broad, kind of a tongue-in-cheek question. But I'm genuinely curious. I don't know really any Native people. I went to a res one time and kind of like walked around and just kind of said hi, but didn't really, get involved. So I'm curious, have you heard from Native Americans? Have they spoken to you of any specific tribes? Have they talked about your research? Has it been positive or negative? How do you feel like they feel about this?
I get emails from individual Native Americans all the time, supportive emails. Many who are upset at the repatriation movement because they want to know what really happened and are not for the repatriation of remains or the removal of artifacts from museums. So I do get an email that is supportive from Native Americans. I haven't gotten a support, an endorsement from any tribe. I think that the tribes are much more uniform. And when I say the tribes, I mean the tribal politics or the tribal administrator.
The
leadership. So obviously every tribe has lots of people in it. So, but I'm talking about like a tribal leadership. And when I looked at the comments from the latest NAGPRA regulations before the regulations were put in place. They allowed for a period of comments. And I looked through the 181 comments, whatever, that were given, and listened to some others that were given orally. And one of the things that was surprising was there was no disagreement between tribes except for, and maybe I'll say there was one or two, and I'll explain those, but almost every tribe that posted a comment, and of course these are being sent in by the leaders, by either the tribal historic preservation officer or somebody in the position of power, said that the rules and new regulations did not go far enough. And so they said, human remains needs to be redefined to include things like the ground that human remains may have been in, anything that was shed naturally, like hair, photographs, x-rays, data, casts, you name it. They want that included as human remains, and animal remains that were imbued with human spirits. So that was pretty much uniform. The only difference I saw with the tribal comments was that the federally recognized tribes didn't want the non-recognized tribes to be included, and the federally recognized tribes wanted to be included, right? And NAGPRA there really isn't any way to change that aspect of NAGPRA because of there's complicated legal issues about federal recognition and non-federal recognition. So if a non-federally recognized tribe wants to rebury remains from, and even if the university wants to give those remains over, they would have to work with a federally recognized tribe if it's through NAGPRA.
Wow. That's very interesting. Is there anything that you've done in your early work specifically related to this topic that you feel maybe was too hasty or that you regret in terms of, how you said it, or maybe the messaging of it, or maybe just even like an ideology regarding this topic altogether?
No. I mean, I'm not infallible, people make mistakes, obviously. And there have been times when I think, I could have collected more data, or I could have done this, early on in my career, I thought that there was stronger evidence for environmental influence on bones than I do now. And so there are differences. And even the Ryan Mound, for a long time, I was convinced that it was all one people's This is a large collection from San Jose State that spans about 2,500 years, with the earliest people being about 3,000 years ago, and the most recent about 1,500, or even 1,700 maybe. One of the things is that I was fairly convinced that the collection was one by what we would call biologically continuity. And through my years of researching those remains, and through enabling others to come to that collection, I'm now convinced that this is not the case, and that the collection does belong to several different populations that replaced one another. And so I wish I hadn't been such a softie early on in that case.
We're going to take a break real quick because you have back hair. Yeah. And if you're like any other dude in the world with back hair, you probably have your wife, your girlfriend, your boyfriend. You probably have to ask them, hey, could you get this spot on my back? I know this is embarrassing. I know this is awkward. Maybe you're a Greek guy. Who knows what your problem is? But I have your solution. It's called Backscape. Backscape is this fancy little gizmo right here. Look at this. It is an all-in-one handle with the smoothest shave you've probably ever seen in your life. You just take this right back here, and you can hit every hard-to-reach spot on your entire body. Now, I'm sure you're wondering, Mark, this seems like overkill, right? This seems crazy, right? A whole apparatus just to shave your back. This is going to be so inconvenient. Here's where it gets wild. You watching this? The top of the shaver pops out. Easy. Now you have a tiny little handheld shaver that can get every other part of your body. Let's say you got chest hair. Maybe you got leg hair. Maybe you got some bushes. That's where this comes in, baby. As easy as that, it can slide in and out of the 2.0 friction fit handle. Just that easy. This folds up, one button, and this is going underneath your sink. Out of sight, out of mind. No one even has to know. Backscape is so confident that you're going to love this product that if you don't love it, they will give you your money back. That's how confident they are. They're willing to put their money on the line. And for the listeners of this show, we're going to offer you 10% off with the promo code CAMP on your first order on any of the kits on their website. That's right. You go to Backscape, BAKSCAPE.com, and use the promo code CAMP, C-A-M-P. You will get 10% off your first order on any of the kits on their website. I'm telling you guys, this is the way we're shaving from now on. This is how we're shaving our backs, our butts, our faces probably. You can probably shave your head with this. I don't even know. I never will. But if you're looking for the shaver of the future, it's at Backscape.com. Now let's get back to the show.
It's interesting. This is a really interesting topic and just a really tricky, I guess, ethical debate. I'm really appreciate you explaining it to me because I can kind of see both sides. I can obviously see the scientific side. It's like, hey, we want to get all the data on the table. We want to push science forward. We want to understand the whole story. In order to do that, we need to have skeletal remains to do the research, to get the data, to push the whole field, into the future. But on the other hand, as someone that grew up quite religious, still has a lot of like fond religious ties to Catholicism, so much of Catholicism is imbued with the idea of sacred relics, where, there's a saint or, a religious figure historically who maybe there's a piece of their bone or a piece of, their skin or their hair or something like that that's being preserved. And I could imagine, if an archaeologist said, hey, or anthropologist, said, hey, we need to get access to John the Baptist's skull because we need to do research on it, and we're going to confiscate it from this church where it's on display, and we're actually going to move it into our private archive. That would piss me off. And I would say, hey, that's not really fair. Like, this is a historic relic that as Catholics, we've honored and shown reverence for, and I don't know how these scientists will treat it, or maybe they'll look at it and say, actually, this isn't John the Baptist because they have some type of agenda to discredit the Catholic Church. I'm not sure. So I can understand from that perspective, like, maybe I would feel a certain type of way. So I'm curious, how would you quell my feeling about that?
It's kind of interesting. I mean, the Catholics are actually very open to having their remains on display. The catacombs, for example.
Right. Yeah. And there's a lot of preserved saints that are...
Yes, yeah. So it's kind of interesting nuance. Throughout Europe, cemeteries are excavated all the time to make room for others. And those collections are then studied. So one of the compromises I actually was always engaged in when I was throughout my years at San Jose State was we talked about DNA research and how I don't do DNA research. But one of my jobs as a curator of the collection was to ensure that other people could come and study the collection. And because DNA research is destructive, like certain other research is destructive too, like isotope research. I've always said, well, you know what? I think this is a time to ask everybody involved because you can't go back, right? If you make a mistake there, So and I would say that's the John the Baptist DNA test, right? Would be the same thing. Is there another way to do this without destroying the relic or the bones and so forth? And so I do think that when you were talking about destructive data, you might be more sensitive but most research is not destructive. And therefore, unless your faith would be weakened, why would you not want research on it? I don't think is a good enough argument, right? It's interesting. We talked about Kennewick Man. It's interesting that when Kennewick Man was was not allowed to be touched by researchers, the government, the Department of Interior, allowed religious folk to come and visit Kennewick Man. And I believe the remains were in storage in the Burke Museum, but I could be wrong about that. And what ended up happening was, so they allowed the Native Americans to go in and worship the remains. And they allowed like neo-pagans who thought that this was like the, earliest, European in America or whatever, to go in. Both of which I think were a mistake to allow, without supervision. And one of the leg bones of Kennewick Man was actually stolen by somebody who was religious, because the scientists were always observed.
Oh, really? So there's a leg bone that's missing.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And a leg bone, and they didn't find it out until the scientists went in, because it had like two left, I think shin bone, but I could be wrong on that, like two left shin bones. So somebody
replaced it.
Yes.
Wow.
And that was not a scientist. That was one of the religious people who was able to gain access without supervision. The scientists were always supervised.
Wow. That's interesting. That's very, very interesting. Before we move on, is there anything else on this specific topic that you think would be pertinent for the audience to think about?
Well, we sometimes forget that this research, when we talk a lot about the research on how to reconstruct the past, but we sometimes forget that this research also has a very applicable purposes. Forensic anthropologists first basically learn how to identify sex and age and injuries and the bones themselves in archaeological settings, in classrooms with teaching collections from archaeological sites. And so when we lose this, we're also going to lose the greatest ability to teach forensics, and that will have real life consequences for the people that are the most vulnerable, those people who have died and were skeletalized and perhaps not even missed until their bodies became bone. And it's not just this kind of theoretical, esoteric thing, but this is a real life consequence.
Can you talk to me about the sex and gender debate that's happening within anthropology as well?
Sure. So one of the things that we do as anthropologists is we look at whether skeletons would belong to a male or female. We're very good at doing this. We're much better at determining whether somebody had been a male or female than had they been how old they were, right? For example, and one of the reasons is that there are changes throughout the skeleton that occur with the different sex hormones. So, for example, with females, you get a more gracile skeleton overall because when bone is deposited, it's deposited more on the inner part of the bone than on the outside. And with men, it's the opposite. And so you get a very much a more robust, larger diameter of like the humerus. And the other thing is that, the giving birth to big-brained babies, difficult to say, right? Changes the pelvis. And so you can tell what differences there are based on the pelvis. But this also then changes the angles of the leg bones, for example. The skull of males and females are different. So if you have the whole skeleton, we're probably about 99% accuracy, 99.5 and percent accuracy in adults post-puberty.
That makes sense.
With DNA, it's even more, of course, but you don't want to have to do DNA tests on every bone, on every remains just to determine male, female. It's expensive. It takes time.
It's also destructive.
And it's destructive. But like if you find somebody who was murdered, you want to figure things out pretty quickly, and so that's one of the things. So we're very good at determining male, female. There's now a push to prevent anthropologists from undertaking this task because there's a push to claim that sex is not binary, that it's on a spectrum. And I think it was in October that I was told I was going to give a conference talk and a panel about binary sex at the American Anthropological Association. And our presentations, the panel, got accepted in June or July. And then in September or October, we got an email saying that our panel was being withdrawn. It's the first time in the American Anthropological Association's history, 122 years, I believe, that they've withdrew a panel that they had formally accepted. And they said it would be harmful. But they also said that the science was settled. And we know that science is never settled. The science is settled, that sex is not binary, and therefore we were unscientific as well. And it's interesting that I actually thought that my talk for the panel and my title was actually very open-minded about the issue of spectrum and gender. So the title was something along the lines of, make no bones about it, skeletons are binary, skeletons are binary, people may not be. And so what I was doing was saying, if you look at sex, biological sex through the skeleton, then you're talking male, female. But gender is the expression of that. And so people may express themselves in many different ways. And when I was growing into my academic life, right, as an anthropologist, we always were taught that gender and sex are different. And now they've combined that. And what that does is it tries to get rid of the biological concept of binary sex. Part of it is they argue that this is just Western colonialists who have put this upon everybody, that there are males and females, which is, again, this kind of postmodern agenda that there are no facts. There's no truth. But the other part of it is, I think, a misunderstanding on some people's take about differences with intersex, what was sometimes called intersex individuals, or disorders of sexual development, where you have individuals who have morphologies that don't match what the norm or the average, right? And my position on that is that these individuals are still male or female, as the DNA shows, as if they can reproduce, as the reproduction shows, but rather that they have a congenital birth defect or congenital pathology or disease. And I've been told that that's like, that's kind of transphobic or, not politically correct, or however you want to say it, but it's a truth. And it's not mean or transphobic or discriminatory to say that some people have disorders, pathologies. It's life. We see it in animals, other animals too. And so when you look at things like people who are born with XXY or XYY as a 23rd, this is just a pathology. Many of these people cannot reproduce. And so that also further shows that it's a pathology.
Interesting. Yeah, I just to make a distinction on that, obviously women would be born with XX chromosomes and men would have XY chromosomes.
Correct.
And that you could look at the DNA makeup of a person and you could discern whether their skeleton is male or female.
Yeah.
Now, hypothetically, if someone was born with like Klinefelter syndrome, like you had described, having like XXY, or maybe someone was born intersex and they are female presenting, but they have internal testicles that are producing testosterone at a high rate. Do those things change the genetic makeup of the bones? Like if you were to examine the bones of someone with Klinefelter syndrome, what would you deduce hypothetically?
You would deduce that they have Klinefelter syndrome.
Oh, really?
You can look at the pattern of changes throughout the skeleton and diagnose that. And this is called paleopathology, diseases of the past.
Interesting.
And so, yes, we can look at skeletons and say, yes, this person had this disorder. We can also look at skeletons and see sometimes whether somebody was castrated, like the castrati.
Oh, really?
Right? Because it changes their bone. It
Interesting.
doesn't change their sex, but it changes their bone in specific ways that enable us to see that this individual had undergone that.
Interesting. So, like hypothetically, in Rome, there was eunuchs, or maybe it's Greece.
Yeah,
I can't remember.
Yeah,
Ancient society, probably both, if I had to guess. And typically, these eunuchs were sort of close with female royalty, perhaps, in a lot of these like older civilizations, and as a way to preserve the king's bloodline and make sure that none of the servants to the queen were going to maybe have sex with her and have children with her and then have an illegitimate heir to the throne. They would basically castrate men that then would work as servants. Yeah. And these men would be chosen at a young age and they would basically have their balls removed.
Yes.
And they would then be a servant to the queen, and they wouldn't be able to reproduce, obviously, because they don't have testicles. And as a result, they're not producing testosterone in the same way, I'm assuming.
That's
and
correct.
Then their bones, you would still be able to discern that they're male, but you would be able to tell based off of the amount of hormones, the amount of sex hormones that were being, infused with the bones.
So basically, what you end up with a male skeleton where the growth pattern is the time that the individual can grow is elongated, and the bones are longer and more gracile, but you don't get like the changes in the pelvis to look like a female. So there are like distinct patterns that are found, and they have done research on castrati.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so, and I think that people think, she's calling these people diseased. That's mean.
Right.
But it's not mean. It's truthful. And for some people, it's very sad. And why wouldn't we want to be able to explain the fact as best we can? And it's not a moral judgment, it's just fact with those things. It's just like we know when you have cousin marriages, so inbreeding, you get some increase in some skeletal defects. You get extra teeth is one thing. We call them supernumerary, extra numbers teeth, and extra digits, extra fingers. And in a sense, this is not a judgment call. Oh, that population had inbreeding. Island populations sometimes do. And it doesn't necessarily even have to be that they understood it as inbreeding. And there's a big distinction between incest and inbreeding. Incest is immoral and considered immoral pretty much in every culture. But how you define incest differs slightly from culture to culture, even though there are some universals. But inbreeding throws some problems along the way too. It's not a moral judgment. It's just what happens. And I also, in my talk, one of the things that I looked at was when you're looking at forensic cases, can you identify if somebody did identify as a trans individual? So if people are taking hormones, or even more obviously undergoing feminization surgery that changes this skull, that changes that. If a forensic anthropologist found the individual, could they say, yes, this was a male, but presented as a female? That would be important to know. And so we should not be abandoning sex. We should just be trying to increase our ability to fine-tune our way of understanding how people express themselves if they've undergone medical changes. And so I think that that's not anti-trans at all. I think that's actually looking for ways to help all people. But nevertheless, I was considered, persona non grata and kicked off, even though even in my abstract, I had mentioned that was one of the things I was going to talk about. Interesting.
Yeah, I guess just on a personal basis, and I'm not sure if anyone's asked you directly, I mean, do you have any type of personal agenda against trans ideology, or do you think trans people should not be, afforded the right to, participate in, sports or vote or anything like that that would infringe on their personal rights?
I'm not a sports person. I do think that there is problems with males competing with females based on what I know of the biological differences between males and females, that gives it an unfair advantage to the males. And I do think that there is concern of letting children make decisions, medical decisions of all kinds.
Sure.
A lot of times people will say, well, what about it? If a 16-year-old girl wanted breast implants, I'm like, I would be against that too, Right. But do I think adults, should be able to make these decisions? Yeah, I think that's for that adult in the medical community and so forth. For me, it's not a moral decision. It's not. I don't look at people who live their lives differently and think, oh, that's immoral. It's more a matter of, are we willing to turn children into lifelong patients? Because that's what you're doing with that. And so I do think that that's very difficult to allow. And I would say that about a whole bunch of things. We don't let children get tattoos.
Right.
And tattoos are more irreversible. So in a sense, I do think with children, you do have to say, is this really the right direction? Now, I don't have children. I don't have any children, so I don't know how I would feel if it was my child. And I'm not saying that, I think most people who are in these kinds of dilemmas are trying the best that they can. I think that I would say, I'm not going to sign off on any medical things. Once you're an adult, it's out of my hands. But I would also not say, you can't dress like a girl if you're a boy. Dress however you want, present yourself however you want. But I wouldn't medical things because I know what it does to bones.
For children specifically.
For children specifically.
That makes sense. Yeah, I think those caveats, and there's obviously an ongoing social debate about those things, and I think it is reasonable, sports and children specifically. If a 30-year-old person said, hey, I want to take hormones and transition and present as a different gender because, they believe that that's part of their gender identity, you would have no personal issue with that.
I'm from San Francisco. So, I knew people back in the late 80s and early 90s who represented themselves as others who were my friends. It's not, I don't have that. It's not a moral issue. I don't have that kind of take on it.
That makes sense. Your issue is just primarily when identifying remains, you think it is important to specify if it's male or female.
Female, yes. And work on ways to identify if people presented themselves differently. And what's interesting is in the research that I looked at on the facial feminization surgery, what they did was they took, some of the research did CT scans, but others did MRIs of people who had undergone the surgery, and the sample sizes are so small; they're like 12, right? So it's just beginning in a sense, and they entered the metrics of the person's face into a database called Fordisk, which is a huge forensic database of metrics that help you determine age, sex, ethnicity. And what they found was even after the facial feminization surgery, this individual still lined up, the 12 individuals still lined up with male. Even after, the surgery, even after years of hormones, that the Fordisk did not catch that the individual was trans. Now, we don't have the skeletons, of course, because those individuals are still living.
Right.
And we have such small sample sizes. So, maybe in the future, with bigger data sets, more comparisons, maybe we will find that we can tell when somebody had that surgery. Yeah.
What is the alternative if you're doing some type of excavation and you're looking at bones and trying to understand who this person was that you're holding? What is the alternative if you're not going to discern the age or how old the person was, the age in terms of, how
when they died.
Yeah, when they died, exactly.
What years did
Yeah,
they
exactly.
live?
So what years did they live? How old are they? What sex are they? Those types of things. What would be the alternative to that in terms of the sex question? Would they just say, oh, we don't determine the sex?
Yes, that's what they would be saying. And that might not matter if you're looking at skeletal remains from Rome or whatever, that it's not, but it matters in the sense that when forensic anthropologists are learning, they're learning on archaeological samples. Almost always, they're learning that the techniques on archaeological samples, and therefore, if they're not learning it in archaeology, they won't be as good at it when they get to be forensic anthropologists.
Interesting.
So it spills over in that way.
And I've heard some different research that, just as an example, that in some hunter-gatherer groups, it was actually the women of the tribe that would go and they would hunt, and that the men might actually stay back in the tribe. This is an example that I had heard before.
I'm not sure I believe that. I've read the latest research that's come out about that and had argued that women's skeletons are actually better for hunting. I don't think that that's true. And the reason there's three key things why I think this falls apart. One is it doesn't take into consideration pregnancy. You're going to not be as good of a hunter or huntress if you're pregnant.
Mm-hmm.
2, it does not take into consideration breastfeeding, right? So once you have that child, so that's the second one. And then 3, we see that there are more trauma related to hunting in many populations than in males than in females. So those are my 3 things. Now, I suspect that in many tribes, that if there was any chance of getting some meat, they would take it with little animals. And actually, lots of research has shown that the big game was much less common than the rabbits and so forth, the rabbits and rodents. And I suspect that women and men engaged in that. And I'm not saying that no women hunted, but I don't think that it's a flipped narrative where the men are staying home taking care of the kids, and the women are hunting. And most populations in the past, if you look universally, you have patterns of injuries, and one of those patterns is that children are injured less. And that's because they are protected, and hunting can be dangerous. They're not taking those kids on dangerous hunts with big game animal. I just don't believe that.
That makes sense. Yeah. That actually makes a lot of sense to me. And I guess looking at research like that, this idea that, women hunted as well would be research that I'm sure, like the feminist science community would really appreciate. And they would say, this is, interesting for us because it doesn't show that we are, just passive, children birthing machines. And, I think as a lot of women might feel like their role historically has been. But I guess this new kind of push to not gender or not identify the sex of different bones, you wouldn't be able to draw those types of conclusions.
Yes,
so
exactly.
You would say, did women or men, did they hunt within these hunter-gatherer tribes? And anthropologists would have to throw up their hands and say, we don't know.
We don't know, yeah.
Because we don't necessarily know how these people were, identifying or what their expression was.
Yeah.
Now, I'm curious, because the argument here just seems so absurd to me. Like, it seems just so clear. Like, I don't know what anthropologists would hear this and say, of course, biological sex doesn't matter and it's completely irrelevant and we should be looking at these bones just on the sake of, other things and not the biological sex at all. That to me seems very anti-scientific, and I kind of refuse to believe that there's a massive community of anthropologists that don't accept that that's important. Obviously, you've been in contact with more people than I have in this regard.
It's incredible. It is incredible. So the American Anthropological Association is one of the biggest groups of anthropologists, and they've issued a statement that basically saying that sex is non-binary, and that
sex is non-binary, not gender. They said sex.
Sex, yes. And the American Association of Biological Anthropologists have issued a very similar statement. Actually, it's almost even more inflammatory in a sense, or an outrageous or absurd, whatever word you want to say, coming from them, because that includes like the genetic anthropologists, the skeletal anthropologists, the primate anthropologists. Those are all the biological ones.
Now, are you the only anthropologist that takes issue with this?
No, I'm not the only one. Obviously, the other people in my panel who were canceled, see it as well. But it's so hard to really assess how many people believe some of these things, because there is also a lot of self-censorship and fear. And when my book first came out, Repatriation and Erasing the Past, in 2020, it came out to coincide with the 30-year anniversary of NAGPRA. And there was a huge backlash against it, open letter with over about 900 signatures from scholars all over the world, anthropologists, archaeologists, all over the world, calling for the book to be pulled. And yet, very few people, stood up against this. But people would reach out to me and tell me, I agree with you, but I just don't name me. Don't name me. Or I was thinking about, should I send you this email through my university email or through my private one? And I decided to send it through my private one. Or, I've always agreed with you, but I can't say it.
And would these be well-known and well-published anthropologists?
Some of them, yeah. Some of them state archaeologists, some of them, chairs in departments, some of them, even, and some of them up and coming. So there were some people who obviously stood up, and like the ones who wrote amicus briefs for me, the ones who, wrote reviews for on the book, and that you can see on Amazon, the blurbs, right? But few and far in between. And I think the same thing is happening with the gender sex conflation, and the sex is non-binary because of that.
Yeah, it's to me again, it just seems like just such a wild position to take. But I wonder if there's, from the other side of the argument, if there is maybe like a miscommunication or a more nuanced point that they're trying to convey within like these, larger societies. Or do you think it is truly just a postmodern creep into academia that's kind of poisoning the academic process?
That's very hard to say. Some of them are extremely bright people with excellent communication skills. If they haven't been able to get the nuanced point across, I would be surprised. I do think it's ideological, and that they're pushing an ideology, and it's killing the science.
And why is the ideology being pushed?
I do think it's this postmodern agenda and guilt. Guilt for our past, whether it's because of we dug skeletal remains, or we did research on skeletal remains that shouldn't have been done, or we're part of the colonial movement, and none of us are. It was so long ago, right? I don't feel guilt or shame for something that, if an anthropologist 200 years ago did some grave robbing, that's not on me. Just like if a Native American and 200 years ago kidnapped a little white child, settler child, which happened, that's not on them. I don't see it that way, but I do think that that's part of it. And then perhaps some of the other part is they want to be able to work and collaborate with people who will not collaborate with them if they don't agree to these concessions, both in the Native American case, but also now there's a lot of overlap with the trans issue and the Native American issue. So I think that there's a fear of being kicked out.
Now, as someone like yourself that has been a tenured professor in these types of institutions, what do you think would be a solution going forward? What is the way out of this type of thing if what you're saying is true, that there's a postmodern creep that's kind of getting pushed into the schools?
We just have to take back science and speak up when you know that what is being pushed is not science, and call out when something is being treated in a hypocritical way, like with the Native American creation myths versus the Christian creation myths. We have to speak up and hopefully at some point something will change. There's going to be another generation. Maybe they will see things differently. Maybe there will be a rebellion. I would love to see NAGPRA repealed on the basis of the church and state issue. I would also be very happy if the Supreme Court case that is going on now about the Chevron changes, that basically it's the issue is that many laws are changed over years because they basically bring in experts, and this has been allowed without going back to Congress to change the law. And that's what has happened with NAGPRA. So if you actually read the law, it's still the original one, of course, but there's all these regulations that people follow, and these have happened without going back to Congress. And so the Chevron case deals with this issue, but on an environmental basis. But if it turns out that the status quo is overturned because it's considered unconstitutional, that might mean that NAGPRA has to go to its original form.
Interesting.
Which would be a huge victory. It would be a dream come true, but I'm not hopeful.
Interesting. I see. So what's happening, I guess, from a legal perspective is that the law is getting passed. The law has regulations A, B, and C. And then over time, there is additional regulations added by some type of government body that's not the U.S. government.
Right.
And then now universities and individuals have to follow regulations A, B, C, D, E, and F.
Yes.
Even though only A, B, and C are the ones that are actually codified.
Were actually voted on. And
I see. Interesting. And this is happening, I'm assuming, with the car or with Chevron.
It's an environmental fishing issue.
Interesting.
So, and I don't know the ins and outs of the case, and I have read a little bit about it, but it revolves around fisheries and the environment.
Interesting. That makes sense.
And Chevron was the company that I guess was involved in the initial.
Interesting. Well, this is all very interesting. I definitely want to take some time to read more of your articles and get more of a grasp on this. I truly hope that there's some type of compromise. Obviously, the idea that an individual religion could, I guess, impinge on scientific research, to me seems obviously antithetical to the separation of church and state. While at the same time, I understand that, as someone that comes from a religion with relics, having protection with those relics and reverence for whatever sacred, human items people are handling would be something that would be really important. So yeah, it's an interesting topic, and I appreciate you explaining it in, all the detail that you did. That really made a lot of sense to me. If people are interested in learning more or reading more about this, what's the best place they can go to find out?
I do have a website. I don't know it off the top of my head. I am on Twitter at @eweissunburied.
Amazing.
And that does have a link to my website too.
Well, Dr. Weiss, thank you so much. I really appreciate this. I would love to have you back. We can talk more about just general anthropology and how we got here and any updates on this topic as well.
Would love that.
Amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.